Hello. So today I'm presenting the paper around tensions and trade-offs in community organizations' use of ICTs for commoning during the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, I would like to say that I'm currently based in Montreal, Canada, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Ganyan-Gehaka Nation, who are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters. Moving forward, I just wanted to clarify that when we talk about commons and commoning practices, we are referring to the collective creation, management, and sustaining of community resources for collective benefit. So to give you a bit of perspective and background about this research, I would like to mention that it's part of an EU project that was examining how community organizations and generative commons that produce and use resources with underprivileged communities in Europe and the UK navigate the challenges of access to these resources, including open source platforms and digital technology. When we refer to access, we mention it as emerging from the power-laden socio-technical infrastructures that enable people to benefit from services and resources. In other words, how people are able to derive benefits from the resources that are being co-produced. So the research aims of this specific research study were, again, as I mentioned, to better understand how organizations and commons that produce resources for underprivileged communities through commoning navigate the challenges of access to these resources. And second of all, to explore the trade-offs at play in the choice and use of digital technology during the COVID-19 pandemic to enable participation in the production of commons and the use of such common resources. So as you are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic brought in a lot of restrictions, lockdowns, and shifts on how community organizations operate. Therefore, for the context of this research study, we were examining one of the most deprived regions of the United Kingdom. We wanted to see how community organizations operated during the pandemic. And that's why we had to expand the definition of commons to include different kinds of community organizations and commons, including community gardens, housing schemes, mental health organizations, artist studios, property developer, co-housing schemes, and other kinds of organizations. We conducted 15 semi-structured interviews over Zoom or the phone because it was at a time where there were restrictions due to the pandemic. Based on the findings of those interviews, we realized we had to conduct a follow-up participatory workshop with the participants, and therefore we invited them to a workshop and used Miro as a tool, which enabled a lot of the participants to participate remotely if they couldn't make it to the venue. The workshop aimed to explore what were the current practices of those organizations, the workarounds, the trade-offs they had to engage in due to the pandemic, the challenges they encountered, the access to resources they have, the opportunities for digital technology. So this is a screenshot of the Miro board. As I already mentioned, we had different types of activities to have a better understanding how such organizations had to cope with the pandemic, and particularly focusing on the challenges they encountered and what were the opportunities they felt we could capitalize on and move forward when it came to digital technology. So the main takeaways from this research study indicated that the production and maintenance of community-based common resources entail complexities which were associated with the need to protect already scarce resources while attending high levels of vulnerability. So to give you an example, one of the groups we worked with mentioned that they are responsible of a community garden that hosts both elderly people and young, vulnerable young people. They mentioned that they could not allow those two groups to mix together, and they also had to restrict access of the community garden to the wider public, which is a bit different from what the meaning of commoning meant, but it also meant that they were trying to protect those vulnerable groups from any types of harm. Therefore, when we come back to the idea of access, it's not just about the physical access, but also it was related on the norms, values of care, and relationship of trust that these organizations have established both internally and with the communities they work with. Looking more closely to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized that it magnified challenges related to digital literacy among the communities that those organizations were working with. A lot of them mentioned, for example, that some of the groups they worked with didn't have access to internet. So they resorted to the public Wi-Fi on the public bus. Therefore, they couldn't really resort to digital technology as means to provide services. A lot of them also mentioned that this also indicated that there was a lack of knowledge among communities when it came to digital technology, but also there was a lack of desire to use technology. And specifically, they mentioned that people were not really interested in other kind of digital tools that were different from tools they were already familiar with, like Facebook, for example. So this also raised questions around digital inclusion and accessibility. For other organizations, they mentioned that the COVID-19 pandemic presented an opportunity because of digital technology. This kind of technology allowed them to increase the reach of people they actually were able to work with, in contrast to when they were providing services in person. It also enabled them to create new type of resources, such as, for example, online videos, and it also enabled them to continue their services while being under restrictions and lockdowns. All of the organizations agreed that there were some trade-offs that they had to do when it came to the choice of digital technology. They really had to trade off ethics and control over data, in contrast to using a proprietary technology that were perceived to be easier, familiar, and more affordable, while open source tools were seen to have some technical difficulties that hindered their use. A lot of the other members of staff were not very keen on experimenting with new tools. And for a lot of them, because of the communities they work with, and for many different constraints, they wanted to stick to the technology they were already able to use. So a lot of them also mentioned that there was a limited breathing room to explore possibilities for technology, and they had to use whatever was available because they had to abide by time and financial constraints, which hindered their ability to explore further opportunities when it came to digital technology. So moving forward, we ask ourselves and ask the PDC community, how do we help overcome such barriers when it comes to the use and design of open source platforms and tools? And how do we reconfigure open source tools to be appealing and somewhat easier to adopt? Three things we thought about. First of all, we have to revise and reflect about current practices underlying digital commons, specifically that there is some sort of elitist approach when designing those tools, since they don't really factor in that some people are not very comfortable using these open source tools due to some of the challenges I already mentioned. In addition, we have to co-develop and present proposals for open source tools that are co-created with those living in conditions of precarity or deprivation. And those tools have to be more responsive and relevant to the values and needs of such communities. And finally, we have to capitalize on funding opportunities which endure more ethical digital technology. And this has been noticed by a lot of shifts, even within governments, towards the adoption of more ethical technology versus the use of proprietary technology that are sometimes perceived are not being very ethical. Thank you so much for listening for this presentation.